Hello and welcome to my channel. Here's another drawing of a beautiful horse. Again, I use the same combination of colored pencils and pastels. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the drawing process and some of my tools. This time we have a slightly different setting, slightly different background with some nice green and blue colors. So let's get to it. You can see some of my soft pastels on the left, and these are Kohinoor soft pastels, and you can also see that I will be using some pastel pencils as well. On the left you can see an olive green Conti pastel pencil, which I'm going to be using for much of the grass and foliage. My sketch was mostly done with a light brown colored pencil. The reason why I use a colored pencil for this is because it doesn't smudge, it won't blend in with the pastel, so I can work around it and over it with my pastel. I'm starting to work on the background using a white soft pastel, and the reason why I'm putting down some white pastel is because I want the sky to look it to look smoother and to blend more nicely when I apply blue over it. So now I'm blending it with my finger, which is probably the quickest way to do it with large areas, and adding a little bit more as needed. And now I'm adding the blue on top. So like I said, when I put down the white first, the blue will be a little bit lighter and it will blend nicely and evenly. But there's another added advantage to that, as you will see when I start drawing clouds. Because when I start drawing clouds, when I use my eraser, I just remove a little bit of that blue and the white shows up, and then I can use that pastel dust of both the white and the blue pastel to create some very smooth, soft, fluffy looking clouds, as you will see. And now I'm blending the blue in with my fingers as well. Because I want everything to be very light and very smooth, I'm adding a little bit more white on top. So you have to know how the pastels work. When you want something to be lighter, generally you have to put a lighter pastel underneath first. You can also see that I put in a little bit of different kind of blue here to add a little bit of a reddish tone there. Anyway, now I'm starting to work on the clouds, and pastels erase pretty easily, but what makes things even easier is because I put down the white pastel first. So now all I have to do is rub out the slightly darker bluish pastel pigment so that the white will show up. And I'm just trying to create some nice shapes that look like a cloud, trying to make it look like my light source is coming slightly from the left. And now I can use my finger to just pull gently downwards, and what that does is it blends in the white and the blue areas, and it also lifts up a little bit of the blue, because pastels are easy to move around, and you can sometimes lift up a little bit just by pulling your finger over it. You don't necessarily have to use an eraser, although an eraser will obviously lift up more. But the reason why I am using my finger is because I want it to be very smooth. I want the lower portion of that cloud to be a little bit darker and to be fading into the blue background of the sky. So this way you can create some really nice looking fluffy light clouds. So I'm adding a few more here on the right, and then my sky will be done, and I'll be moving on to the to some trees and bushes and grass, which is behind the horse. So now I'm going to do that. I grabbed a Conte yellowish green, olive green pastel. But here, because there's going to be some grass behind the horse, I decided to add a little bit of light yellow soft pastel first, because I want the grass to be a little more yellowish and a little bit lighter. So I'm going to use that under my green, and I'm blending that. This time I'm not using my finger. I'm using a piece of spongy material that mouse pads are made of. That's what I normally use to blend pastels, although sometimes I can also use tortillas and brushes. But this thing blends really well. So now you can see that I added a little bit of my green on top, and this is pretty much the tone or the color of the grass that I was going for. Slightly lighter yellowish green. But now you can see that I'm starting to draw some trees and bushes here in the background. And I'm going to use a nice pointed tortilla just to push that pigment around a little bit and blend it in slightly. And now I'm using a dark green soft pastel to put in some darker tones in that tree, canopy or bush, whatever it is. It's only partly visible because it's on the horizon. Or above those hills. Anyway, I'm gonna slightly blend that in with the same spongy material. Alright. And finally, I'm gonna add a little bit of the black, because I think it'll give me a nice color, plus it will help me create some shadows and texture and define the shape a little bit better. So break that foliage into segments, as I normally do when drawing trees. Alright, so now I'm adding a few blades of grass, or suggestions of blades of grass, on that grass to the left, and here I'm moving on with some more foliage and some more trees, just using that same approach, trying to create these irregular looking shapes on the horizon. Trying to create some shapes that look like bushes and trees. And as always, I add a little bit of the darker green on top of the lighter one, and then I go in with a darker color, something like a black or something like that, to create shadows and texture to make it look like real foliage. So here I decided to start working a little bit on the horse's head, And I'm going to use a combination of colored pencils and pastels, but first I like to start out with colored pencils. And the reason why I do that is because, as I've mentioned, colored pencils don't really blend or smudge, unlike the pastels. So when I put down these lines, especially darker ones, they will tend to stick, and when I go over them with a pastel, either accidentally or intentionally, they will still remain there, they won't be blended in, and I will be able to leave them there or work around them or integrate them into the rest of the drawing. So now I'm adding a little more detail and color to the mane, which is going to be colorful. It's going to be it's going to have a couple of nice colors. And now I grabbed a soft pastel, which I'm going to be using to paint these reddish patches on my horse. The pastel that I'm using is an English red, which I used in the previous drawing of a wild Mustang. So these paint horses come with a variety of colors, but I really like this combination of this reddish brown and white. And I'm going to be using this English red for my mid-tone, as it were, because I'm going to have some darker browns and some lighter browns in there as well. I'm going to create the lighter tones by simply blending it or smudging it around a little bit over the white parts of the paper so that it becomes lighter. So I'm just going to push tiny amounts of pigment in those areas which I want to remain lighter, and those areas which I want to be darker, I'm going to be adding some slightly darker brown to them, as well as some colored pencils as well. So I did a little bit of work on the nose and the snout and the mouth, and now I'm using a darker reddish brown, also a soft pastel, to add some darker tones in these reddish patches. But I'm also going to try to suggest some shadows on the horse's head. And for blending, again, I'm using that spongy material. So I have to push the darker pigment into the lighter one so that it would blend nicely. And then I can use my colored pencils to further define some of the edges and maybe create a little bit of texture, try to imitate the appearance of short fur and things like that. So here I had to work around these white hairs of the mane, but that's no problem. I can always erase them a little bit or even add a little bit of the white pen on top if needed. And here I decided to add some bushes on the left. These are going to be a little bit darker than the grass, and also I'm going to need them to create some contrast with the lighter areas of the horse's head, which I need to clean up a little bit so that I can create a nice clean edge there. For some of the darker areas and shadows on the horse's head, I used a little bit of the darker brown, but also I used a little bit of the black colored pencil and a violet pencil as well. Normally some artists recommend that you shouldn't be using black and white in your drawings and paintings. I strongly disagree with that, and I think that you can see that they work fine. When I see something that looks black, I just use black. Also, for shading some of the lighter areas on the horse, I will be using a 2H graphite pencil. I'll be using for the white fur. I'll be using that for the white fur because I want something really, really light, even lighter than my grey colored pencil. So I just decided to use a little bit of that graphite pencil. Because a lot of the horse is almost completely white with just a few shadows here and there, very light shadows, which I'm going to accomplish or describe nicely using a graphite pencil. Now I'm working on this part of the mane here, and I'm trying to add a few tones to it, mostly using colored pencils for it. I'm using a couple of browns, and these are Faber-Castell colored pencils. I'm using a burnt sienna, which is kind of reddish, and a Van Dyke brown. So I'm kind of combining these two to get a slightly different brown from the patches on the horse's body, to add even more color and variation to the horse. And you can also see that I did a nice bit of work on the bushes in the on the left and in the background. And now I'm just adding in some more of these reddish, brownish patches on the horse's body. I'm going to blend those in and soften their edges a little bit, but I'm going to be refining their shape as well as their texture using a burnt sienna and some other browns. And to add a little bit of shadow, I'm also using this darker brown soft pastel here and there. These shadows are very important, not just to stay consistent with the light source, but also to show the horse's anatomy and his muscles and things like that. So I planned this whole video to be about 40 minutes because I'm going to do some parts of it in time-lapse, as you can see. And others are going to be in real time. So now I'm showing you some portions of how I did this in real time. But I think the whole drawing took about 4 or 5 hours, probably less than that, in real time. So I'm going to collapse some of the footage, but you'll still be able to see all of it either in real time or in time-lapse. I simply slowed down a little bit for you to see some of the most interesting bits, and later, as the drawing progresses, I'm going to be using more and more of the time-lapse because I'm going to be pretty much repeating the same things I did previously, using the same techniques and the same tools. Also, a word or two about my colored pencils. I use multiple brands. I mostly used Faber-Castell Polychromos for these browns, but I also have some Stadlers and some other cheaper ones. Brands aren't really that important to me as long as I can get the color that I want. But you also see that I have no problem combining some other types of pencils, like the graphite pencil that I'm using now, for some of this lighter shading on the body and around the neck, because these areas need to be really light, and I want a very light shadow. I just decided to use a little bit of the graphite pencil. So I think so far the head looks very convincing and realistic in terms of anatomy and colors. And I'm going to be moving on to the body and the rest of the background. I'm also trying to add a few darker tones to the mane and under the neck. And here you can see that I'm also using a reddish brown, which is burnt sienna, on top of these reddish patches which I've done with a pastel, to modify their shape a little bit and I'll add a little more texture and shading to them. Here I'm doing the same thing that I did with the grass. On the left I am first adding a little bit of the yellowish, light yellowish pastel, and then adding a little bit of my olive green, because I want the grass to be a little bit lighter and a little bit yellowish in tone. And I also have to finish this row of bushes in the background here. Again, doing the same thing basically. That's why I'm playing this in time-lapse. I'm doing the same thing that I did with the trees in the background. I first laid down the green, establishing the basic tone and the basic shape, and then I put some darker green on top, and then I put some black in between these darker areas and to create some texture. And now I'm doing a little bit of the work on the grass here in the foreground. I covered that yellowish pastel with my Conti olive green pastel, and I am trying to add some more detail to it. As you can see, my strokes are getting longer and longer as they approach the foreground, because the blades of grass closer to us are going to be taller and more defined. But I'm going to blend this in. I don't want them to stand out too much. And then on top of that, I'll actually be re-adding or reapplying that same light yellowish soft pastel to create some highlights in the grass and some lighter blades of grass. And now I'm working on the front legs and shading those, shading around the knees and the thighs. Trying to keep in mind where my light source is. Again, I'm using the English red soft pastel to do some more of these patches on the body. And if this looks very quick and careless, it's because it is. The thing about soft pastels is that they are so easy to blend, and that they are so easy to block in larger areas. And that's one of the main reasons why I am choosing to use this combination of colored pencils and pastels, because with colored pencils this would be a much slower process. I've actually done a drawing, a larger size portrait of a horse. I think it was a bay horse with some reddish tones, for a lady from Australia, and I did that entirely in colored pencil, and I can tell you that the process took quite a bit longer than this, because soft pastels make everything a lot faster, but you have to get to know the medium because they can be pretty messy. They can be pretty messy, and there's a lot of dust flying around, and you have to be very careful about the order in which you put in your elements, because they can smudge easily and ruin the appearance of some of the work that you've already done. So now I'm trying to finish the foliage on the right behind the horse. Again, I'm going to try to make it look like there's a bunch of trees and bushes there in the background. And now I'm adding a bit more of that dark green pastel on top of the lighter green, and blending that a little bit, and then I'll put in some more darker tones. I don't want too much texture there in the background because I don't want it to be too distracting. I want some texture and some detail so that it looks pretty realistic, but I think I need to soften it just a little bit, otherwise it'll be a little bit too distracting and compete with the subject in the foreground. So I softened everything just a little bit with a brush, just to subdue that contrast a little bit. Now I'm using a kneaded eraser to lift up some of the darker pastel and create some lighter areas within this foliage. I want to make it look like some of those bushes are in front of the others, and like some of them are getting more light than the others, like some of the leaves are sticking out. And I also want to define their shape so that they don't look like a bunch of leaves, but so that there's some kind of structure so that you can almost make out individual trees and bushes. Here I'm using that dark reddish brown pastel to go over the English red and add some darker tones. As you can see, the part of the horse which is under the belly is a lot darker, so it's getting less light because it's facing away from the light source. So the further up I go, the lighter it gets, and the lightest areas are around the top of the horse's back. And I actually blend that and soften that really well with a brush. The brush here allowed me to achieve nicer transitions than any other tool would. And again, I'm going back in with colored pencil, this reddish brown, to work a little bit on the edges of these patches. Maybe add a few more dots here and there, and maybe make the shape a little more irregular, but also at the same time, I don't know how much you can see, but I'm making very tiny strokes to imitate the appearance of the fur, so I'm also adding a little bit of detail to the appearance of the horse. Not all of it will be visible here on camera, but in real life all of my drawings are quite a bit more detailed than what you can see on photos or videos. I'm pretty happy with the way the back turned out, and I achieved a nice looking shadow here around the back legs and thighs, around the hind legs and thighs and the butt. So I don't think I'll be messing with it too much. I'm also adding a little bit of this deep blue color for the darker areas, and now I have just a few more areas to cover with a soft pastel, just a few more areas of this reddish brown. But this part here around the tail will be a little bit darker. So there's another front leg to be done. But first, of course, I have to do some of the background also. As before, I'm covering this with a light yellow color to create my base, and then on top of that I'm adding some variation to create some suggestions of blades of grass. I want the grass to be a little bit fuller, a little bit taller, but at the same time I also have to add in some of these darker blades of grass where there would be shadow under the horse. I can't have the horse just hanging there in the middle of the field. So a shadow under the horse, these darker blades of grass, they will help to integrate the horse better into the scene. And I'm making this leg a little bit darker, especially the middle part here and the part that is just under the chest, because it's further away from the light source and it's in the shadow. And here on the butt I'm also refining the appearance of these reddish patches and shading the white parts as well, so that they wouldn't remain white and so that they wouldn't end up looking flat, and also giving them a little bit of texture. And now I'm doing the same thing with the hind legs, just shading a little bit, adding more texture and more detail. The horse will be done very soon, but at this point I was already kind of bored with drawing this grass and background, so I don't really know how much work I put into it, but I found drawing grass here a little bit monotonous. And one of the things you noticed about my drawings, whether they're charcoal drawings or color drawings, is that I tend to simplify the grass as much as possible, because I just make a few suggestions here and there of some variation in value and tone in the grass, and that's about it. I don't like to spend too much time working on it. I need to add a few more bushes here on the right to complete my composition and to create a feeling of distance. So this bush that I'm working on right now is slightly behind the horse, and then the bush on the left is further behind, further in the distance away than this bush on the right, and then of course the trees and bushes on the slope on the horizon are even further away. So I'm putting in all these objects to create some distance and depth in my scene. I'm trying to draw this tail using similar colors as I did with the mane, but I'm going to make it in single color, just a little bit of darker but brown with also some reddish tones here and there. And I also have to give it a little bit of structure, kind of separate it into a few segments before I move on to the other hind leg, the right hind leg, which is the only thing left to be done. First the lighter reddish brown, then the darker one as usual, to shade everything, make it a little bit darker. Also I'm working on the edges a little bit, trying to clean them up because I need a clean edge. I need a very clean edge there. And once I shade all of this, the drawing will be pretty much done. So here it is. I removed the tape from the corners and I sprayed it with some fixative. There's a small signature, and that's it. As always, check out my other videos. I have plenty of stuff that is worth watching in my opinion. Do subscribe, give me a like, comment, let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.